Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to this session on interoperability with persistent identifiers, or PIDs. My name is Sheila Rabin, and I am the program leader for persistent identifier communities at Lyrasis. So for this talk, I'm going to be focused on ORCID and DOIs, specifically the ORCID API and the DataCite API. So I'm fairly confident that interoperability is a shared goal among academic libraries. So the goal is to have system interoperability, data interoperability. We're trying to get away from silos or cylinders of excellence, as my colleague Lauren DeMont at University of Rochester calls them. But in order to have interoperability, we need to have specifications or standards that everyone can follow. So persistent identifiers like ORCID and DOIs are standards that enable interoperability and contribute to increased trust and efficiency in the research and scholarly ecosystem. Persistent identifiers also contribute to open research infrastructure by supporting fair data principles, making research data more findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And I know that many people are already familiar with ORCID and DOIs, but just in case anyone is new to persistent identifiers, or maybe you don't think about them every day like I do, here's a quick refresher. So ORCID allows for interoperability of data about people and their affiliations and contributions. ORCID stands for Open Researcher and Contributor Identifier. And ORCID IDs are unique persistent identifiers for people to help with name disambiguation. So anyone can get an ORCID ID for free, and the ORCID organization is a nonprofit, community-driven organization that manages the ORCID registry with support from organizational members across the globe. So ORCID IDs link to ORCID records, which serve as an interoperable hub of information metadata about individual researchers and their affiliations and activities. So as long as individuals continue to keep their information in their ORCID record up to date and continue to use ORCID IDs to identify themselves, we can use ORCID to distinguish between individuals regardless of any changes in names or any other changes over time. DOIs allow for interoperability of metadata about things. So in many cases, these are things like publications and various research objects in scholarship. DOI stands for Digital Object Identifier, and the object that a DOI identifies does not have to be digital, but the identifier is digital. And it's hosted at doi.org and points to a landing page that contains information about the object and ideally a way to access that object. So what you're seeing here is an example of a DOI for a slide deck presentation in Zenodo. So there's a URL that points to, that the DOI points to. And there are a few different DOI registration agencies, but the most common, at least in the US, are Crossref and DataCite. And so organizations can become members of Crossref and DataCite in order to assign DOIs to your own local content. And so as long as the metadata for each object is kept up to date, the object can always be found through its DOI. And there are many different persistent identifiers out there. For example, the Research Organization Registry, or ROR, is a newish open standard for identifying organizations. But for example, with ORCID and DOIs and all of the other persistent identifiers that are out there, we do have the ability to include PIDs in the metadata of other PIDs. So for example, like you're seeing here, ORCID IDs can be included in DOI metadata, and DOIs can be included in ORCID metadata. And everything is then linked together in a human and machine readable ecosystem of interoperable data about our individual and collective research activities, which brings me to the idea of the PID graph, which is a kind of newish trend in the PID landscape. So the example that I'm sharing here is from my colleague in Australia, Melroy Almeida, and this is what's called a PID graph. And basically, this was shared at the PIDapalooza conference in January of this year. And what you're seeing here is a data visualization that shows the research organizations who are working on coronavirus research in December of 2009. There were roughly 1,500 research organizations involved, and the visualization is highlighting contributions from the United States and Great Britain. And if we fast forward 10 years in December of 2019, we're seeing that there are just over 3,000 research organizations involved. And this time we're seeing highlights from China, Brazil, and Spain, for example. And then more recently, as of December 2020, which was just a few months ago, this number of organizations has grown exponentially. There are over 46,000 organizations involved, as you can see. And through this visualization, we can zoom in and we can actually see the specific organizations that are involved, who is participating, who is collaborating, how many publications have come out, how the research was funded. And we can get this information thanks to persistent identifiers. In this specific case, the data here is coming from ORCID and DOIs. And so this visualization is somewhat of an extreme example, but the idea is that libraries can use persistent identifiers to more efficiently and accurately gather information about research activities. So tracking faculty publications, tracking use of resources in an institutional repository or open educational resources, for example. And working with research data and data management plans, for example. So backing up now to the ORCID and DataCite APIs and how we can work with them. So for ORCID, anyone can access the ORCID public API. You just have to have your own ORCID ID and be logged into your ORCID record and go to the Developer Tools tab. And the ORCID public API allows us to do 4 things. We can use the public API to search the ORCID registry for public data and search for people and their affiliated information. We can also allow individuals to log in to an application using their ORCID credentials. Just like you would see options to log in with Facebook or Gmail, ORCID is a trusted way to allow people to log in. We can use the public API to get researchers authenticated IDs. And this is important because when we're trying to identify which ORCID ID belongs to what person, there's a lot of room for error there with manual entry of a 16-digit number. And also because of the fact that multiple people can have the same name or a person's name could change over time. Basically, ORCID uses the OAuth process to allow an application to collect individuals' ORCID IDs in an authenticated manner. And it's basically where the individual logs into their ORCID record and then they're presented with an authorization screen like you're seeing here, authorizing access for a system or an institution to get your authenticated ORCID ID. And then that ORCID ID number is passed to the local system through the API rather than a manual entry. And finally, the public API allows us to read or import any public data from somebody's ORCID record into a local system. So basically, individuals have full control over the visibility of their data in ORCID, and they can choose to set their information to public, private, or trusted parties only. So basically, any information that is set to the everyone or public setting can be read using the public API. And when I talk about information from within an ORCID record, I'm talking about biographical information, employment history, education history, funding that somebody's received, works that somebody has contributed to, all of these kinds of things that you might expect to see on like a CV or a resume, for example. Now, ORCID does have a member API as well, and through the member API, you can ask for permission during that OAuth process to read data that's set to trusted parties only, as well as that everyone setting. And users can also authorize permission during the OAuth process to allow an organization or a system to add information to their ORCID record for them. And this data transfer is done through either XML or JSON. So the Orcid Member API allows for that two-way flow of data between ORCID and organizational systems. And by using the Orcid Member API to add data to somebody's ORCID record, the source of those entries will appear as the name of the organization, which lends more authority and credibility to the assertion. And what you're seeing here is just a few examples of member institutions that have written data to somebody's ORCID record. And so you're seeing that source. And just a side note, the Premium Member API also allows for webhooks notifications. So you can basically receive an alert anytime information has been updated on somebody's ORCID record. And there are several systems that already have the ORCID API built in, either just using the public functionality or with the ability for member organizations to turn on their member functionality for reading and writing. And some of the common examples are systems that you're seeing here, Pure, Faculty 180, Digital Measures, these kinds of research information systems. InfoEd, Esploro is a new one for repositories. And for open source systems, for example, there's a plugin for OJS that's really easy to turn on. Vivo, for example, has an API connection that can be configured. And so basically the ease of integrating with the ORCID API really just depends on what specific systems you're using and the resources that are available to you to do customization. Many libraries are, they're also creating custom ORCID API integrations and applications and microservices. And there are so many examples I don't really have time to go into today, but just a handful of those examples are listed here. And so I encourage you to go check those out. All right, now for DOIs. The basic thing to remember is that every DOI represents an object and is connected to metadata about that object, which is a bit more straightforward because we don't have to rely on individuals to do authentication. And so DataCite has a REST API, and there's again a public and a member API. So the public API allows us to retrieve, query, and browse the metadata that is available in existing DOIs. Results are returned in JSON, so they can be easily parsed and used for a variety of purposes. And again, just highlighting here in the XML that we're seeing an ORCID ID and a ROR ID included in this DOI metadata. So the more we can include persistent identifiers in persistent identifier metadata, the more everything can be connected. The member API allows for automated creation of DOIs within local systems and affiliated metadata. And members can also use the member API to manage their repositories and their DOI prefixes. So DataCite also has a number of certified service providers, including those that you see here, that have capabilities for automated creation of DOIs using the member API. And again, the ability to use the DataCite API will depend on what specific systems you're using. So for vendor systems, they do need to have the API built in. And for custom or open source systems, you basically just need a developer who can, set up the configuration. So the effort will vary. It really just depends on what systems you're using. So if you want to get yourself and your library involved in using PIDs, there are some actions you can take right now, including one, getting your own ORCID ID if you don't already have one. If you do have an ORCID ID, you might go log in and make sure that it's up to date. I've been using mine as basically my main record for keeping track of everything that I'm doing. So I don't even have a Word doc resume anymore. I just use my ORCID ID. Also, your organization can become a member of ORCID or a member of DataCite or Crossref if you want to use these member APIs in your local systems. And if you're interested in learning more about these and other types of persistent identifiers, I would encourage you to join the PID forum, which is a global communication channel for all things related to persistent identifiers, and look into PIDapalooza, which is a conference, an annual conference that is solely dedicated to persistent identifiers. And if your organization is interested in going that membership route for ORCID or DataCite, for example, we do have consortial community groups administered by Lyrasis, through which any nonprofit organization can join and become a member of either ORCID or a consortial DataCite member. So basically, the ORCID US community was formed a couple of years ago in 2018 as a partnership between Lyrasis, the Greater Western Library Alliance, the Northeast Research Libraries, and the Big Ten Academic Alliance. But of course, you don't have to be a member of any of those groups to join. And some of the benefits just include cost sharing, dedicated support, and being part of a community of practice around ORCID. And we have just over 140 member organizations right now. So it's going strong. And then for the DataCite Consortium, this was just formed this year. So we're just getting started. And again, the same benefits apply in terms of membership, cost sharing, dedicated support, and participation in a community of practice, which is already in existence. I know there are a lot of libraries that have already been involved with DataCite and Crossref and DOIs. So if you want to get involved too, let me know. Any nonprofit organization can join either of these groups. You don't have to be a member of Lyrasis or one of the other consortia. So if you do have any questions or if you have ideas about using the APIs, I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for attending and have a great day.